We're out here at the Share Farm and Logan Center, and this is our second year on this project. This year we came in and we put corn in, which was again a challenge this spring, as most farmers had a difficult spring with wet conditions and the soils were just saturated. But we did get the corn planted, and then we interseeded the corn with actually a farmer-built piece of equipment, which I always love using stuff that farmers are working with and creating. So we seeded 60 pounds of cereal rye, 2 pounds of radish, and 2 pounds of winter camelina. This is an excellent catch on an interseeded cover crop. You can see how tall this rye is. It's really amazing how well it's done. And I think a lot of that's because when we ran the interseeder in this corn, it actually seeded it. It didn't just broadcast it, but it actually seeded it in the ground. And so that gives us just a much better establishment of cover crop. And I think that's pretty critical when we're looking at interseeding is you can fly it on, you can broadcast it, you can do all kinds of ways to get it in there, but really the seeding of the cover crop in the soil is one of the best ways to get it established. One of the things I look at when we get this rye established in corn is how much is it growing and what's it going to be like to manage next spring. And so with the rye getting actually such a decent stand in here, we're going to get some growth when the corn is drying down, and also when it's harvested, because we're going to have that sunlight come to the rye, and also it's going to be cooler temperatures, so it's actually going to do a little bit better and put on some growth and some biomass. So it means that next spring we're going to need to watch it and make sure that before we plant soybean into it, that number one, it hasn't dried up the soil too much, and if it is doing that and it's a dry spring, then we need to terminate the rye early. If it's a wet spring, we can let it grow and then plant the soybean into it later after it's managed some moisture. One of the things I really like about interseeding corn is that where you have an imperfect stand, the cover crops actually will compete with some of the weeds that may come into this area. So it just gives you a little extra competition to help with your herbicide program potentially in these areas where your corn stand is not perfect.
The cereal rye, radish, and winter camelina interseeded into corn as a tool to manage weeds in season, like you had mentioned in your video. How will this help manage the weeds that we may face this spring?
Yeah, that's a great question, Angie. And you know, the overwintering cover crops like cereal rye or winter camelina, which is a broadleaf overwintering cover crop, will be growing in the spring. And so one of the goals of that is to manage moisture, to reduce erosion, to help us kind of get a seed bed that we want to plant into, and also to manage weeds. And so some of those early growing, early season weeds, rye will actually do a good job managing it. Now, it won't eliminate the weeds, but what it's done, and we've got strips across different farms and areas where we've looked at rye and no rye, where there will be the same number of weeds, but the biomass is 10 times less when cereal rye is growing. So that means that your modes of action, your herbicide applications are going to be better at killing those weeds, hopefully helping with management there. And also it gives you a little bit more time to get back to that field if you need to. If you have other priority fields you need to spray that don't have rye on them, now you've got a field where the weeds are being kept in check and kept smaller by a cover crop that's competing with them. That being said, you got to be really careful with the rye in your rotation and how you're managing that.
So what do you need to watch for, since we know that cover crops aren't just a plant, walk away and forget about type of deal?
Yeah, I think that's one of the worst things that can happen with a cover crop is seeding it and then walking away and not managing it. So cover crops need to be managed like a cash crop. Anything from seeding it, right? I mean, we saw a really great establishment in corn because the cover crop was seeded. And now, granted, I'm going to tell you that was one of the best interseeded corn stands I've ever had. And it just was a phenomenal stand, and I wouldn't expect that every year. But seeding that cover crop in the ground, whether it's interseeded in corn, or if you're coming in after wheat and you're going to seed a cover crop instead of broadcast it, you're going to get a better stand. You're going to get a more uniform stand. Now, if you want to go in and you broadcast it, you're going to get, expect a stand that you would get broadcasting a cash crop, right? I mean, it's going to be spotty. That's not always bad, but if you get, the cover crops growing well in the high clay soils where it's wetter and you need the cover crop growing to use moisture, but you don't get it on the sandier knobs, then that's okay. It's good to have a non-uniform stand in that case when broadcasting. So I think, it's the management of it. It's the spraying out of the rye in the spring when it's dry. So you can guarantee this spring I will be watching those fields where we have research projects, and farmers, if you have rye in your fields, you should be watching them this spring because we are very dry. And if we go into the spring and you dry out that seed zone where you're going to plant your crop, especially soybean, it could set you back an entire growth stage for the season. So, so making sure you're out there terminating it when it's appropriate, which is right about when that field, the soil looks good for planting, is when you should be spraying out your rye, whether you're planting it that day or a week from then.
Abby, one of the questions that came in was, with the dry fall, did the cover crop steal any yield or affect moisture of the corn?
That's a good question, and that is a concern. It's generally not recommended to have a cover crop there when you're planting corn, right? So that's one reason we don't plant corn into rye in the spring, is because that competition, the water use, the nitrogen tie-up could cause yield reductions. When interseeding, you don't seed the cover crop at the same time you plant corn. You give the corn a head start, and when it's like 5 to 8 leaf is where, after that, you can come in and seed the rye or interseed between the corn rows. If you have a piece of equipment that you can get in there with, a lot of farmers are building different pieces of equipment now, or you're going to fly on a cover crop like rye at tasseling. And that's when you're going to get your cover crop in the system. So if you're going, definitely expect a yield reduction. If you're planting corn into a cover crop, a living cover crop, that is, not just dead residue, expect when you're planting corn into a living cover crop, you're going to lose yield. In some cases, I think they were reporting like 40 or 50 bushel yield loss on corn in Minnesota. But if you're coming in after 5 to 8 leaf, then you should be okay. I love the video with Brandon, and that was a lot of fun to film. And he's got such an outstanding, he's using rye in such a great way on his farm. And that's the tailgate talk video we saw earlier. And he's really specific with twin rows and fertilizing at the same time. And, Angie, I was curious, and I've driven around with you a little bit, but how else are you seeing rye or other cover crops even used as a tool in Steele County?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because I always like to show off what our growers are doing. And, rye has been a great asset in terms of helping with erosion control. That's one thing where, we've got producers getting it out there. I would say primarily in our PP acres, our prevent plant, because not only are we helping with erosion control, but in a case where we did have so much excess moisture, that rye was able to suck up that water. And I know for producers that use winter rye in their rotation, they were able to get out into those fields so much quicker in the spring because it had used enough moisture to be able to get out into that field, versus maybe a field next to it that didn't have that winter rye planted, and they weren't able to get into it just because it was still so wet. So you hit the nail on the head when you're talking about moisture usage, because you have to be careful. You have to manage what your intentions are, because it is a plant. It wants water, it needs water, and it's going to use it. And so it's just finding that healthy balance. But absolutely, we've got producers that we've even got individuals that are on with us today that I know are increased growers of our very own North Dakota born and raised rye varieties. And so rye is definitely picking up in our county.
There's some use of, I think it's Dillon and Gardner rye are the two varieties that have been developed by Steve Zwinger out at Carrington REC. And the nice thing about those rye varieties, they're going to be a little bit more expensive, but they also are grown here so that they are going to be more cold tolerant. So one of those things going over the winter, rye is one of our best overwintering cover crops, better than winter wheat, certainly better than winter camelina. It's just a great way to have an overwinter or winter annual cover crop. And so you can kind of hedge your bets and use some of those varieties that are produced in North Dakota to know what you're going to get, whether it's the height of it or the early emergence and competition with weeds. I think they've bred that. The Gardner rye, I think, is an early competitor. So if you have a problem with early season weeds, having rye out there seeded the fall before is actually going to get a jump on those weeds and be more competitive. So there are specific reasons to the breeding behind the rye that can be really useful. I work with a lot of growers that do interseed their corn with the intention of grazing post-harvest. And so so one of the things that they do in that scenario is they throw in a radish and turnip. So it's small seeded, so you could broadcast it, because if you're going to broadcast a cover crop seed, you want it to be small, right? So a radish and turnip fit the bill there. You could be side dressing your nitrogen and using some kind of box to broadcast it or drop it down tubes if you kind of outfit your self-propelled sprayer that way. Or your broadcast or side dress unit. So there's lots of ways that you can get cover crops in that system. And I would say that in that case, radish and turnip are some of the best to do that. If you do have cereal rye, you could spring graze it, which is a great option. You need to be in there probably before May 10th, which, by the way, is my birthday, in case anyone's curious. But if you're in there before May 10th, then you can get the best quality forage out of that system. So there's a lot of ways to do it. As you saw in my video, there was the Dirt Workshop dirtworkshopnd.com webpage, and we've actually have a lot of videos that we had from that event in December on grazing. And listening to Kevin Sedovic, Miranda Meehan, other farmers that are using these practices, you're going to get a ton of information out of those, and you can find that on our NDSU Soil Health YouTube channel.
Abby, that parallels perfectly with our just where can our producers get more information. You have a lot of stuff. Let's face it, you make North Dakota look doggone good when it comes to the research you've done for cover crops, and where can we find all of this information?
So I've worked really hard at developing those online resources, because I know that, if you're like me, you wake up in the middle of the night and you're thinking about cover crops and soil health, so you got to get your information then. So there is the NDSU Soil Health webpage. And so I think it's ndsu.edu/soil health. And that's kind of your landing page for everything that you're going to need to access. We've developed our page in a way that is actually farmer friendly. So we looked at your monitors and your combine and your equipment, and we designed the page in a very similar way. A lot of buttons that you push to get to the information. I think the layout's pretty intuitive. If it's not, you can sure let me know, and we can. I'd love your feedback. But on there, you're also going to see a couple booklets that we've developed on soil health, incorporating cover crops and grazing cover crops. Those are like magazines, basically. They've got these great photos in them. You can look through those. We have a lot of videos on our YouTube channel. So there's a video tab. You can get to all those videos. This winter, I think I've added another 50 or so. So just be ready for a dark hole of information as you start watching them. And then also podcasts. We've got the Soil Sense podcast and the Field Check podcast, which I hire somebody to host those, because I am not a podcast host, but I know somebody who is. And they do a great job of talking about what farmers are doing, what we're learning in research, what we're doing in extension. It helps tell the story of what we're doing in North Dakota. So you can get a lot of information there while you're out planting this spring, and you can just listen to them. They're all under 30 minutes. So lots of information. You could also get on my listserv if you want. If you want your name on that listserv, Angie can certainly send it to me. And then you'll get the links and the updates as we produce more information.
So Abby's definitely been an amazing mentor and role model for me. So don't be surprised this summer if you see a state fleet or even our own Steele County vehicle driving around and checking out your places, because I really want to showcase to her the amazing work that you are all doing when it comes to soil health and how you've integrated some type of cover crop system into your operation. So Abby, are there any other final thoughts you have?
When farmers are using cover crops, you don't just use them for the sake of using cover crops. There are very specific goals that you have, and this is the tool that works to achieve that goal. So if you don't have a goal, don't just go out and seed a bunch of cover crops, and then who knows if it's successful or not. So if your goal is to control erosion, cover crops may help provide that cover that you need to control that erosion. If you want to manage water, both after wheat harvest because you have excess water, or you need to manage excess water in the spring using something like cereal rye, or say you need to reduce evaporation and manage your moisture that way, laying down that rye or rolling it so that it lays flat on the surface is going to reduce evaporation help you there too. And then also the weed pressures. It's one more mode of action, and I think it's a good way if you're going to compete with it. We rely on our crop canopies to compete with weeds, so why not create another canopy with cover crops to compete with those weeds and those resources? So that's one of the things I wanted to touch on. But then I also wanted to talk too about that. The issue of millet and palmer, and that was kind of brought up earlier by Angie as to being a way that palmer found its way into North Dakota. And I don't want everybody to think that cover crops are bad, but what I'm going to tell you is that when seed is in short supply, when there's a lot of prevent plant and everybody is going after all the same seed for cover crops, that's when these things slip into the system. So my way around it, every farmer I work with where I'm seeding cover crops, I send it off to the North Dakota State Seed. I get a subsample from the company, whether it's a well-known seed company or it's a farmer where I'm buying some non-protected seed out of a bin. I always send a sample to the North Dakota State Seed. It's like $50 to find out if there's weeds in there, and they'll tell you which ones. And the turnaround time is like 24 hours. So if you have concerns about that and you want to make sure that, if you are using a millet, get a sample from that seed company, send it into the state seed, get it tested, make sure that it's clear and that it's a clean seed source. So there are ways to get around that. Just like you would make sure that the crops you plant are a good variety, that they're weed free, that they're going to do the things that you want them to do. You can do the same with cover crops and just kind of hedge your bets that way.